Hello, I'm Chris Gibbons, editor of Acumen, and I'm pleased to be able to tell you that Acumen #3 is on the bookshelves in the stores and on its way to you who have subscribed to it, and it's a bumper edition. We have an extraordinary cover story featuring one of Greg Marinovich's photographs of Marikana, but that sets up an article by South Africa's leading mining writer David Mackay, and obviously Marikana on everyone's minds still, even now here in the new year. We're looking at the effect of Marikana on South Africa's mining industry. And I have to tell you, the prognosis is not as good as it needs to be. We also have one of our GIBS experts, Professor Steve Bluin, HR expert. Steve's a former director of SAB, and he's just published a book about the management of global talent. There is a war for talent in the global economy. Senior, skilled executives who can write their own ticket in almost any country. But how do you manage them? What are the challenges that they bring with them in those briefcases and suitcases? We have a feature by David Williams, one of South Africa's best writers, on Sizwe Nkasana, CEO of First Rand Limited. Now, Sizwe is perhaps South Africa's most successful black businessman, and rather than going the tenderpreneur route, he chose the professional route. He's an accountant by training. Guesting, if I can put it that way, from the United States, Francis Fukuyama. Remember Francis Fukuyama, the American academic who coined the phrase, the end of history? Well, his new book, The Origins of Power, has just been published in paperback here in South Africa. I had the opportunity to speak to Francis Fukuyama, described by some as America's leading public intellectual, on the origins of power. What is state power about? Where does the state get its power from? How should a state use that power wisely? Big feature interview with Francis Fukuyama. Some of our regulars in Acumen 3, we have Richard Dowden, former Africa editor of The Economist, now director of the Royal African Society. He is writing about Africa's political paradigm, suggesting that Africa may not evolve into a Western model or an Eastern model, but a specifically African model. Victor Dlamini, one of our regular columnists, Victor asks a very simple question. Are there too many awards in South Africa? Everyone seems to get awards all the time, and if everyone gets awards, do they have any meaning? Dr. Mzukizi Xhobo from the University of Pretoria, leading political analyst, also examining the question of leadership post-Marikana and the need for some kind of social compact, social pact. A very important article that you do need to look at carefully. It's long, it's thoughtful, comes from GIBS Competitiveness and International Business Strategy expert, Dr. Raj Raina. Raj has looked at companies all over the world, he's looked at countries, what makes them competitive, and he's outlined a 16-point roadmap for South Africa. How do we turn this economy around? And the core of his argument is that we need to think about employability, not creating jobs, but creating people who can be employed by businesses. Coming back to the mining side of things, I said we had Greg Marinovich on the front cover. One of his photographs, well, Greg has also done a photo essay for us once again, as he did in Acumen 1. But this time he's looked at a phenomenon called the Zama Zamas. Zama Zamas are informal miners who work in disused mines, old tailings. It's tough, it's brutal, it's dangerous, but they manage to eke out a living. And we ask the question in this photo essay, is this the lowest that a human being can go? Is this poverty expressed at its worst? Or is it in fact entrepreneurship at the very highest level? People who are determined to make a living, determined to feed their families. And they're doing so, of course, just south of Johannesburg here, in a way that the founders of Egoli, the Harrisons and so on and so forth, would recognize, digging gold and digging it by hand on the reef. Sustainability is a buzzword that is on everyone's lips at the moment, but is it only for big companies? A question we ask in the latest edition of Acumen with GIBS sustainability expert Don Gibson. Small companies, can they do it? And if so, how? Can they retrofit sustainability, or should it be built in to the architecture from the word go? We look at a couple of interesting little companies, Impahla Clothing down in Cape Town, Been There Coffee Roastery here in Johannesburg. A regular feature in Acumen is doing business in, and we look at dynamic markets like China and Brazil. This edition, it's the turn of India. And GIBS expert on that wonderful country is Abdullah Varachia, and he gives us the inside track on how to do business in India, the do's, the don'ts, the pitfalls, the structure of the Indian economy, where South African companies are making good, and tips like don't schedule more than 2 meetings a day because you won't get there. India has terrible traffic problems in all of its cities. And then Abdullah also gives us his top 10 places to visit. You know, when the meetings are done and you need to kick back a little bit, he gives you the places to go. We have, at the moment, the African Cup of Nations underway here in South Africa. Another mega event, big sporting event, not quite as big as World Cup 2010 or the Olympics in London last year. We asked the question of GIBS sports marketing expert Michael Goldman, do these mega events actually work? Do they pay the dividends to the cities, to the countries that host them? In other words, is South Africa getting value for money out of AFCON 2013? Did we get value for money out of the World Cup 2010? We also talked to a panel of GIBS experts led by our Dean, Professor Nick Binedell, about the outlook for 2013. Post-Mangaung, you all know the outcome now of Mangaung. Yes, did it turn out the way you thought it would do? I'm sure it did. But what does that mean for our country? What does it mean for the national strategy? Nick Binedell and members of our GIBS faculty here chart the way forward. And then, of course, right at the end, we have our regulars. Caroline Hurry, South Africa's top travel writer. Caroline talks to us about Mauritius. What about Chile, the Atacama Desert? Caroline's been there too. Looks absolutely wonderful. We have Jacques Morin and Stephen Smith, Forward Motion, looking at bikes and backpacks and motor cars. And we have John Matham, our new wine expert, appearing for the second time. John has got some suggestions to stock up your cellar. And then we end off with Victor Dlamini. Victor, our regular front-of-book columnist, also our regular back-of-the-book music columnist. Victor talking about Belgium-based South African jazz singer Tutu Poane, who was back in South Africa recently. Girl comes home to Soweto with her Belgian husband, part of her band. And Victor tells us that it's about to happen big time for Tutu. It's all in, the latest edition of Acumen 3. I recommend it. Please get it at your nearest bookstore. The big ones, CNA, exclusive books. Alternatively, you can find it on the iPad via the iTunes App Store. Simply download it, or the Android store as well. Equally, you can subscribe. We'd love to have you on board as a subscriber. My name's Chris Gibbons, editor of Acumen. Thank you.